Today we're going over extreme survival stories of people who refuse to die. John Colter. It's 1809 and frontiersman John Colter and his friend John Potts are paddling a canoe up the Jefferson River. The two men are hunting for beaver pelts on this expedition, and they both know that they have just crossed into some very dangerous territory. Just a few years earlier, Colter was part of the legendary Lewis and Clark expedition that mapped the previously unexplored American West. While traveling in what is now Montana, the party had some not-so-friendly encounters with the Blackfeet Indians who had lived in this region for generations. These tribes had begun working with British fur companies and now saw the American presence in the area as bad for business. Colter could not help but notice the demand for beaver pelts was skyrocketing. And so in 1806, 2 months before the official end of the expedition, he asked to be honorably discharged and chose to stay out in the wilderness to try to strike it rich. But John was soon given a lesson on just how much the local tribes did not appreciate American fur trappers on their turf. In 1808, the Blackfeet had ambushed him and shot an arrow in his leg. Had the Flathead and Crow Indians he was traveling with not chased them away, he would have been dead. Now, well aware that the Blackfeet did not want them around, the duo were doing everything they could to avoid them at all costs. Colter and Potts continued rowing in silence, hoping they could pass through unnoticed. But as they turned the corner, a cold shiver ran down their spines as hundreds of Blackfeet warriors began stepping out of the forest and onto the riverbank. The warriors don't seem interested in doing business. They gesture for the men to come to them. Colter knows they don't have a lot of options here. So he nervously brings the canoe to shore. The instant he steps onto land, the Blackfeet strip him naked and take his rifle, knife, and every piece of gear he owns. As he watches Colter being stripped bare, Potts begins to imagine the horrific things the Blackfeet have in store for them. He refuses to get off the canoe. The warriors begin to lose patience, and one of them shoots an arrow into him for his stubbornness. Potts, now bleeding, panics and grabs his rifle. He fires at one of the warriors. The Blackfeet return fire with a storm of arrows that turn his body into a pincushion. Horrified, Colter can do nothing but stand there and watch as Potts is dragged ashore and hacked to pieces in front of him. He assumes he's next. He's already calculating the various ways this ends, none of them good. But instead the chief unexpectedly points to the open prairie and tells him to run. Colter couldn't believe what was happening. He was being spared. So he takes off, sprinting naked as fast as his legs will carry him, away from the river, away from the warriors, toward the open prairie that stretches ahead of him to the horizon. He gets maybe a few hundred yards when war cries erupt behind him. And it dawns on him. He had not been set free. He had simply been given a head start. The hunt was on. The prairie ahead of Colter is not the kind of open ground that sounds like salvation. It is a Montana landscape in autumn, which means it is blanketed with prickly pear cactus. Low, ground-hugging, nearly impossible to see until your bare foot has already found it. Every stride Colter takes drives cactus spines into the soles of his feet. He doesn't stop. Can't stop. Behind him, the sound of hundreds of warriors thundering across the same ground, their war cries carrying across the flat land with the clarity of a bell. They know this terrain. They've hunted it their entire lives. They know where every game trail runs and every ridge rises and every river bends. Colter knows something too. He knows the Madison River lies approximately 6 miles due south. He knows this because he spent 3 years mapping this exact territory alongside Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. He knows the river's depth, its banks, its currents. He knows the massive logjams that pile up where the water slows. He runs toward it. His feet are already bleeding. The cactus spines work into soft tissue with each impact, and the skin of his soles, never designed for this kind of punishment, begins to shred. The pain is immediate and extraordinary. Every frontiersman understands pain as information, not command. Information says your feet are damaged. Command says stop. John Colter ignores the command and files the information away. He has run perhaps a mile when he looks back. Most of the war party has already fallen behind. The initial sprint sorted the warriors into those who could sustain pace and those who couldn't. The vast majority are losing ground. The prairie is wide and flat, and Colter's terror-fueled speed has opened a gap. But one warrior is keeping pace. This man is not falling back. If anything, he is gaining. He runs with the fluid efficiency of someone who has spent his entire life moving across this landscape. He carries a spear. He is perhaps 200 yards behind Colter and closing that distance steadily. Colter's nose begins to bleed. The exertion has become so extreme that blood vessels rupture. It pours from his nostrils in a bright stream, coating his lips, running down his chin, spattering his chest with each stride. He is, at this point, running naked and bleeding across a cactus field with a warrior gaining on him and 5 miles still between him and the river. By any reasonable measure, he should be dead within minutes. He keeps running. 2 miles covered. The warrior is at 100 yards now. Coulter can hear him breathing, hear the rhythm of his footfalls, hear the whistle of the spear as the warrior shifts it in his grip, preparing for the throw. Coulter makes a decision that should not work. He stops. He turns around completely and faces the warrior at full speed bearing down on him. The warrior, expecting prey to continue fleeing, is caught completely off guard. He tries to plant his feet and hurl the spear simultaneously, a difficult maneuver even in ideal conditions. The throw goes wild, the spear striking the ground and skipping off to Coulter's left. The warrior stumbles in the follow-through of his throw. Coulter picks up the spear. What happens next is not heroic. It is not glorious. It is 2 men in a field, one with a weapon and one without, and the one with the weapon using it. The warrior dies. Coulter takes the blanket from the warrior's shoulders, his first material possession since being stripped naked on the riverbank. Then he runs. Behind him the sound changes. The war cries of the remaining warriors who had witnessed the confrontation from a distance take on a new register. Fury. Whatever terms existed for a head start hunt have been changed. This is no longer sport. This is vengeance. 4 miles to the river. Coulter runs. His feet are past pain now. They have entered a kind of distant, muted agony that his mind has learned to place behind the primary objective of moving forward. The cactus spines have worked deep. The bleeding is considerable. Each step leaves a small red print on the dry ground. He runs anyway. The river appears. Not close. Not yet. A glittering line on the horizon, the afternoon sun catching the water between cottonwood trees. But visible. Real. Something to aim for. He runs toward the glitter. 4 miles becomes 3. 3 becomes 2. The war cries behind him are still audible, still gaining, but the gap he opened in those first miles has held. The main body of warriors cannot close it. The one man who could keep pace is no longer keeping pace. 1 mile. His legs are operating on something beyond conscious control. His body has moved past the point where comfort or discomfort means anything. There is just the movement. Just the river getting closer. Just the next step and the next and the next. The bank appears beneath his feet and John Coulter doesn't slow down. He hits the water at full speed and goes in completely. The Madison River in autumn is glacier-fed cold, cold enough to take your breath and lock your muscles if you're not moving. Coulter doesn't stop moving. He swims downstream, hard, using the current to carry him faster than his arms could manage alone. Behind him, the first warriors hit the bank seconds later. Spears arc into the water, splashing around him. He dives under the surface, comes up, dives again. He's looking for something specific. The logjam he remembered from his Lewis and Clark surveys. A massive accumulation of fallen trees where the river bends, decades of debris piled and interlocked, creating a structure that extends from the bank into the water and continues downstream for perhaps 40 feet. He finds it. Coulter dives under the surface of the water and swims into the tangle of submerged logs. The logs above him block most of the light. The current pushes and pulls at his body. He works through the maze of timber until he finds what he's looking for, a pocket. A gap between 2 logs just at the water's surface where the river's edge meets the underside of the jam. An airspace, barely large enough for a human head. He gets his face into it. He breathes. Above him, he can hear the warriors on the logs. Their footsteps are transmitted directly through the wood, vibrations he can feel as much as hear. They are searching the surface of the jam, looking downstream, looking across the river. They are 20 inches above his head. The water is cold enough that he can feel his core temperature dropping. His hands, which were numb from the cold within the first minute, have lost most of their dexterity. His feet, which were in agony from the cactus wounds, have gone blessedly, dangerously numb. He cannot move. Any movement creates ripples on the surface that will betray his position. He cannot shiver, though his body is demanding it with every system available. He presses himself against the underside of the logs and holds absolutely still and breathes the thin air of the pocket and listens to his own death walk back and forth above him. The warriors are thorough. Of course they are. They are not amateurs. They search the banks downstream, upstream, across the river. They walk the logs multiple times, looking down through gaps in the timber. At one point, a warrior stops directly above Coulter and peers down into the water. Coulter looks up through the gap and sees the warrior's silhouette. He doesn't breathe, doesn't move, holds every muscle in voluntary stillness while his body screams for warmth and movement and survival. The warrior looks away. moves on. The hours pass in darkness and cold and the occasional thunder of footsteps overhead. The sun crosses the sky in the world above the logjam and descends toward the horizon. Coulter's body temperature continues to drop. His mind cycles through clarity and fog as hypothermia works its way through his physiology. In the clear moments he plans. In the foggy moments he simply endures. He thinks about Potts. Not about the death. He pushes that image to the edges of his mind because entertaining it fully will unmake him, but about the man. 3 years of wilderness together. The way Potts could read weather 2 days out. The particular cadence of his snoring that Coulter had learned to sleep through. All of it now gone in a matter of minutes. All of it reduced to that image on the bank, which he will carry for the rest of his life, however long that turns out to be. Somewhere in those hours he stops thinking about Potts. He stops thinking about anything specific. He simply exists in the air pocket, one hand on the log above, face tilted up, breathing. The footsteps stop. The voices fade. Darkness comes. Coulter waits, not because he is patient by nature, because he has the wisdom of a man who has survived long enough in wilderness to know that the obvious moment to move is often the moment they're waiting for you to move. He waits 2 more hours after the last sound fades. He waits until the cold has progressed far enough that waiting longer risks the ability to move at all. Then, with movements so slow they barely disturb the water, he works his way out from under the logjam and emerges onto the bank. The night is vast and cold and silent. He is alone. His body is a damage report. Feet, destroyed. Core temperature, critically low. Hands, barely functional. Muscle strength, diminished from cold and exertion. He is, in purely physical terms, in no condition to do what he is about to do. He stands on the bank of the Madison River and faces south. Fort Lisa, Manuel Lisa's trading post, lies approximately 200 miles in that direction. 200 miles of wilderness without food, without weapons, without shoes, without any equipment whatsoever. In late autumn, when the temperature drops below freezing most nights and the first snows of the season arrive without warning, a reasonable man might have lain down on that bank and accepted what was coming. John Coulter started walking. He moved at night for the first several days. The darkness was dangerous. He couldn't see the terrain clearly, couldn't see hazards, couldn't navigate with precision. But it also meant the Blackfeet couldn't track him. Couldn't see his movement against the open landscape. The darkness was an imperfect protection, but it was the only protection available. His feet were the immediate problem. The cactus spines had worked deep into the soft tissue during the run. The river immersion had softened the skin further, making the wounds more susceptible to infection. By the morning of the second day, the soles of his feet were swollen and hot and oozing. Each step was its own individual ordeal. He stripped bark from trees. Cottonwood, primarily, soft enough to work with his hands, available along the river corridor he was following south. He shaped pieces into crude coverings, tied them with strips of bark fiber, created something that approximated footwear the way a raft approximates a yacht. They provided minimal cushioning and zero waterproofing and fell apart approximately every 3 hours. He rebuilt them every time. On the second day he found prickly pear fruit, the same plant that had destroyed his feet now offering him calories. The fruit is sweet and sticky and full of seeds that pass through the body with enthusiasm. It was not a meal. It was approximately 12 calories and a reminder that the wilderness contains food if you know where to look. He looked everywhere. He always had. Lewis and Clark had given him something more valuable than any rifle or supply kit: 3 years of intensive education in North American wilderness survival. He knew which roots were edible and which were poison. He knew how to find water in dry terrain by reading the behavior of birds. He knew how to build a debris shelter that could hold body heat through a freezing night. He had simply never needed to apply all of these skills simultaneously, without any backup, with no possibility of rescue. Now he applied them with the focused precision of a man for whom there is no alternative. On the third day the weather changed. The sky went gray in the way that experienced outdoorsmen recognize as the preamble to something serious. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 2 hours. The wind shifted and picked up and carried the particular smell of snow, clean and cold and completely indifferent to the exposed man walking through the grass below. The snow came at night. Coulter was already inside a debris shelter when the first flakes began to fall. He had built it in the lee of a large boulder, packing dry leaves and dead grass into a mound and tunneling into it, his body heat the only warmth source. By morning, 6 inches of snow covered the shelter completely. He was invisible from the outside. He was also nearly frozen. The temperature inside the debris shelter was marginally above freezing. His body had maintained enough core heat to survive the night but not enough to feel warm. His muscles ached with the kind of deep, marrow-level cold that doesn't respond to movement in the short term. He needed to move anyway. He found a large flint outcropping on the fourth day. Spent an hour working at it with another stone until he had a sharp enough edge to use as a tool. With the flint blade he cut wooden strips more precisely. Made better foot coverings. Made a point for a crude thrusting spear, 2 feet long, not a proper weapon, not strong enough to take large game, but sufficient to defend against smaller threats. He was not defenseless anymore. Not well defended, but not defenseless. On the 5th day he killed a ground squirrel. The hunt took most of the morning. Stalking a squirrel with a crude stone-tipped stick required patience he could barely afford and precision that his cold stiffened hands struggled to provide. When it worked, when the squirrel went still, he sat with it for a moment before eating. He ate it raw. There was no fire. Fire meant smoke. Smoke meant Blackfeet. The protein hit his system like medicine. He walked on. The days developed a rhythm that was at once monotonous and desperately precarious. Walk until the feet demand a stop. Stop, rebuild the foot coverings, allow brief rest. Walk again. Find food when available, eat it regardless of temperature or palatability. Build shelter before full dark. Endure the night. Rise and walk again. The river valley guided him south. He followed it because it provided water, because its timber provided shelter material, because its banks provided the mixed terrain that also provided food. He was essentially following a geographic conveyor belt toward safety, moving at a pace that felt impossibly slow relative to the distance remaining. At night, when the debris shelter held enough warmth for his mind to operate beyond pure survival function, he thought about what he'd go back to. Not the past. The past contained Potts's death and he didn't have the luxury of grieving properly yet. He thought about the future. About what kind of life existed on the other side of these 200 miles. This was not optimism. This was strategy. A mind given a destination to move toward functions better than a mind contemplating the void. On the 7th day, Coulter encountered a small winter camp of Crow people, historically less hostile to American trappers than the Blackfeet, and in some cases actively friendly to the fur trade enterprises that brought trade goods into the region. He approached with maximum caution, announcing himself at the edge of the camp rather than walking in. The first warrior who saw him stopped and stared at the apparition emerging from the tree line. A white man, naked except for improvised bark foot coverings and carrying a stick, with the hollowed eyes and damaged skin of someone who had been fighting for survival for a week in the wilderness. Communication was limited. Coulter spoke some trade language, enough to establish basic intent and non-hostility. The Crow provided what they could: food, a fire to warm beside, a piece of hide that could be shaped into better footwear. He stayed one night. The warmth from that fire, the first real warmth since the Jefferson River, was almost painful in its intensity. His damaged skin, his hypothermia-stressed core, his exhausted muscles, all of them responded to heat with the relief of machinery finally given the power it needs to operate properly. He slept 3 hours. Then rose before dawn and walked south again. He had more than 100 miles left. The infection in his feet peaked around day 10. The wounds from the cactus spines, imperfectly cleaned and constantly stressed by walking, had progressed to something serious. The swelling extended from his soles into his ankles. The heat was palpable even through the crude foot coverings. His gait had deteriorated from a walk to a shuffle as his body worked to minimize pressure on the worst affected areas. He found a spring on day 11, clean, cold water welling up from rock. He sat beside it for an hour and treated his feet with the tools available to him. Clean water, a poultice of chewed root matter packed into the open wounds, strips of bark fiber wrapped as tight as he could manage without cutting circulation. It was approximately what a Civil War battlefield surgeon would have done with nothing. It was not adequate, but it slowed the progression. He walked on. The fever came in waves. Some stretches of walking were clear-headed and focused, navigating by sun position and terrain features with the precision of the trained explorer he was. Other stretches blurred at the edges. His feet moved but his mind was elsewhere, back on the Jefferson River, in the river, above the river, somewhere between the logjam and the present moment. In one of the clear stretches he realized he couldn't remember clearly how many days he'd been walking. The Crow camp was a firm landmark. 7 days before that. Maybe 3 days since. 10 days? 11? The fever had softened the edges of his accounting. He kept walking south anyway. Fever doesn't change which direction south is. On what he calculated was day 12 or 13, he came over a ridge line and looked down into a valley and saw, at the far end of it, the structure of human construction. Log walls. A tower. Smoke from chimneys rising in the cold morning air. The specific visual signature of a frontier trading post. Fort Lisa. He stood on the ridge and looked at it for a long moment. His mind was fever-fogged enough that he briefly questioned whether it was real. Whether this was the kind of hallucination that the wilderness produces in damaged minds, the desert mirage, but in reverse, the survival destination appearing just ahead, always and never closer. He watched the smoke for patterns. Real fires produce irregular smoke. Hallucinations produce perfect ones. The smoke was irregular. He walked down the ridge toward the fort. The men inside Fort Lisa were experienced frontiersmen. They had seen all manner of wilderness-damaged travelers arrive at their gates. They thought they had calibrated their responses to the full range of what survival could do to a man. John Coulter walked through their gate and recalibrated that range entirely. What appeared was a human being who had been stripped to his minimum components and had kept walking anyway. Skin burned and cracked from exposure. Feet wrapped in improvised coverings that were more blood than bark at this point. Eyes sunken in a face that had shed every available calorie and then some. Hair and beard tangled with debris from the debris shelters, with bits of bark and leaf that he hadn't had the energy or tools to clear. Eyes completely clear and focused. Manuel Lisa himself came out to see what the commotion was. Coulter told his story in the frontier manner, matter-of-factly, in the present tense, as if recounting something that had happened to someone else while he watched from a slight distance. The Blackfeet, Pots, the run, the river, the logjam, the walk. The men at Fort Lisa were experienced enough to know which parts to believe and experienced enough to understand that all of it was true. They fed him, tended to his feet. The infection required intervention that would have progressed to gangrene without it. They gave him clothes and boots and a blanket and a bunk. They let him sleep. He slept for most of 2 days. When he woke, he was already asking about the state of the beaver trade in the surrounding region. This is the part of John Coulter's story that says the most about him. He went back. After the feet healed. After the wake came back. After the nightmares settled into the background noise of a frontier life that was full of nightmares. He returned to the wilderness. Returned to the beaver trade. Returned to the same general territory where the Blackfeet had stripped him naked and turned him into prey. Because the wilderness was not, for John Coulter, a place of trauma to escape from. It was where he lived. Where he functioned at the peak of his abilities. Where the skills he'd spent his life developing were actually applicable to reality. He went back because retreat was simply not in the architecture of who he was. He survived one more encounter with the Blackfeet in 1810, yet another ambush, yet another narrow escape, this one with his clothes still on. After that, something shifted. He left the wilderness for good. Returned to Missouri. Married a woman named Sally. Settled on a farm and attempted the kind of ordinary life that the frontier had not previously allowed. He died in 1813. Jaundice. In a bed. At approximately 37 years old. Not by Blackfeet arrow. Not by the cold of the Madison River. Not by infection or starvation or any of the 1,000 ways the wilderness had tried to end him. Just illness, ordinary and indiscriminate, claiming a man who had cheated death so many times in extraordinary ways that an ordinary death feels like the final irony. He left something behind besides the story. During his years in the wilderness after leaving Lewis and Clark, Coulter had traveled through the region that is now northwestern Wyoming. He described it to anyone who would listen. Boiling springs erupting from the ground, mud pots bubbling and hissing, geysers throwing columns of water and steam high into the air, the ground itself colored in impossible shades of orange and yellow and red. Nobody believed him. Coulter's hell, they called it. A polite way of suggesting that a man who'd spent too long alone in the wilderness had started seeing things that weren't there. The descriptions were too fantastic. Hot water shooting from the ground. Colored mineral deposits. Geysers. Decades later, formal expeditions confirmed everything he had described, in the location he had described it, in the detail he had described it. We call it Yellowstone National Park. The man who was stripped naked by the Blackfeet and given a head start to die, who ran 6 miles barefoot across cactus, hid for 8 hours in near-freezing water while his death walked above him, and then walked 200 miles without food or equipment through a Montana autumn, also happened to be the first white American to see and document one of the most extraordinary geological features on the continent. And nobody believed him about that either. History has a way of eventually catching up to the men who were right all along. John Coulter was given a head start and told to run. He ran 6 miles. He walked 200 more. He survived an experience that should have produced a body, not a legend. And then he went back. Not because he was fearless. Because fear was information, not command. Because the wilderness was his language and retreat was not in his vocabulary. Because somewhere in the architecture of who he was, there existed a function that other people called survival instinct and he simply called Tuesday. The Blackfeet chief who pointed at the open prairie and said run, thought he was granting a mercy death. A dramatic end instead of a slow one. A sporting chance as a final entertainment. He was actually creating the most difficult thing the wilderness could produce. A man who had already survived the worst of it. Who knew, with the certainty of experience, that he could survive it again. The head start they gave him was the last mistake they made. He didn't just run from death that day. He ran straight through it and kept going.